is not something which has just come about in the past few years. Today, you may hear people say to you, why don't you go home? Why don't you people go home? Or you people just came off the boat. Or they will make us feel as though we are not part of the society here in the Americas. Understanding our history gives us the connection to the past. When you have the connection to the past and you understand your past, then you are more able to understand who you are in the present. If you understand who you are in the present, then you are more capable of charting a future for yourself. If you don't know your past, then you may be confused about who you actually are. And so when we go back into the roots of Muslims in this part of the world, and it's very important for us to know more about each other. You will meet people from different countries and different places, but what is the story of that person? What is the story of the person who comes from China, or who comes from Africa, who comes from Asia, from South America? What is their story? What is the story of their people? This is important for us to unite ourselves as a Jama'ah. We need to have more touch with where we are coming from. And so when we go back to the slavery period, and we're looking at the end of the slavery period in the 19th century, the British were the first to abolish slavery on records. You could see that in the United States they had their Civil War. It was really over in 1865, but the British preceded them. And this drawing here is a caricature of two British parliamentarians on the shore, and they're saying slavery is such a dirty word. It's such a terrible thing. But they understood that they have plantations, they have colonies, their people have a taste for sugar, their people like smoking tobacco and wearing cotton clothes. So you need plantations for this. You need the raw products in order to supply your factories, in order to keep dominant in the world. So they needed some form of cheap labor in order to continue their colonies. Slavery is the cheapest form of labor that in existence, because you just capture the slave, work him or her until she's dead, throw them away, and get another one. But that's inhuman, and it's not morally, defensible. And the countries that felt, European countries that felt that they were high morally, they had the real civilization, they could not justify the slavery continuing. And so they turned to a new system, and that is the indentured labor system. So you see your boat going across, it says Indentured Employment Solutions. So they will have a solution to this. They went to their colonies, and they started the indentured labor system based on a contract. So the British office would then set up, and they would offer people a contract to come into their colonies, usually for a period of about 5 years. That's what your contract. This on the right, that's an actual contract. That's what it looked like. And they would tell the workers, if you come into our colonies, you will have free housing, you will have free medical service, and you'll live in a nice, tropical colony, and you'll help us develop. And if you want to, at the end of your contract, you can extend it till 10 years. And after 10 years, if you decide to leave, we'll let you go home. And on the outside, that sounded like something very interesting. So in 1839, it became legal in the British colonies, and they began the system of indentured labor. In India, the largest country that they took their indentured laborers from was the Indo-Pakistani subcontinent. We'll just say India. And 9/10 of the Indian immigrants who came into the British indentured system were from the Ganges Basin. They left at Calcutta. and also the southern Indian people as well from Madras. One out of six of the people who came across were Muslims. So here's your ports of call here, and if you look at the map, you'll see the Ganges Basin down here. Calcutta is here, right? So it's draining down into this area here. And then Madras down by this area. Okay, so these are the two areas where they took the Indian immigrants, people who signed the contracts to come here to the Americas. And again, 1 in 6 was Muslim. The rest were Hindus. So there's a large amount, the majority actually, who came from the Indian subcontinent were actually Hindus. But 1 in 6 is a large number when you're dealing with people coming in. So this migration, they have some records, for instance, from 1838 to 1924, nearly 500,000 Indians entered into the Caribbean region. And I have some actual shots of, what the people looked like when they were coming in. And if you looked at their colonies, though, you will see many places. Indian immigrants went to Mauritius. There's some numbers here. It's a limited period of time, but they have 453,063. British Guyana, because Guyana in South America is British, French, and Dutch. There's a Dutch Guyana as well. Trinidad, also Jamaica. In Jamaica, they recorded 36,412. Grenada, it's an island in the Caribbean. And St. Lucia as well. The British records show people coming into St. Lucia. Natal is actually South Africa. They call KwaZulu-Natal. And that's the area of Durban, because that's a very tropical area. And generally, they were bringing the Indian indentured laborers into the areas where they had sugar cane because of their knowledge of sugar cane. So then they would use them to cut the cane and then, to feed the sweet tooth of Europe. The population in South Africa, it's a very large population, actually. And, if you go to the eastern side of South Africa, KwaZulu-Natal, Durban, being the main city, is a large Indian population. Mahatma Gandhi, the famous Gandhi, he was actually in South Africa first. Came from India, but he spent time in South Africa. He was a lawyer, and then he went back to India to form his movement. And so St. Kitts and Island, St. Vincent, Reunion, Suriname, Dutch Guyana, Fiji Islands, the Fiji Islands as well. That's where the Indian population comes into that region. Other parts of East Africa, the Seychelles Island as well. And so that's just a glimpse of some of the areas where they went to. Now, the voyage from India into the colonies was not an easy voyage. Sometime it took between 10 to 18 weeks for this journey. For the African slaves that went across, they call it the Middle Passage. And they would be in chains, and many people died. Some jumped over, some were thrown over. There were revolts. For the Indian indentured laborers, they were not in chains, but the conditions were very bad conditions. There was not a luxury liner taking you across. It was horrible conditions. And there were many people who died in this middle passage, which is about 10 to 18 weeks to get you across. But the first boat now, recorded now, the Whitby, it landed in Berbice, the Berbice section of Guyana. And that was on May 5th, 1838. So you have the Whitby coming in. It had left on January 13th. So that was a long journey to get across. And so that landed in the Berbice area of Guyana. So that really is, one of the key areas for indentured laborers in South America. The conditions in this system were very harsh conditions. They were not slaves, but they could not move from the area they were assigned, and you could not misbehave. You had to do your work. And for instance, and this is how the canes looked, they would give you 5 tasks or 5 jobs per week. I'm not sure exactly, but it's like some bushels. 5, you have to do this in a week. It doesn't matter what happens, you're sick or whatever, you must perform these 5 tasks per week. Then in some areas, they gave them pass books. It's like, so this is like a passport. And so if you're traveling between your barracks and the plantation, or if you go from one plantation to another, it's like a pass book that you have to show. And this pass book in South Africa became one of the key issues in the anti-apartheid movement, that the people were sick and tired of carrying these books. The same thing happened there in Guyana. The housing conditions were miserable. It wasn't a luxury, villas or lodges. It's actually is like barracks. So people are literally in these huge barracks, and labor was long, from sunup until sundown. So it's not easy. Although, one thing though, to the advantage again, we have to keep reminding ourselves, they were not slaves. So at least they did not have to, be subject to the indignity of the slaves. However, it was cruelty. Children were made to work. Women also were made to work harshly, cutting cane in the fields. And cutting that sugar cane, if you've ever been in an area where the sugar cane is there and you cut it and then the mills, this is not easy work. This is tough work. Because that cane is like really tough, right? So you've got to have a cutlass, sharpen it, and then you've got to cut it, and and then it's tough on your feet. This is not easy work to actually do. And so they were forced to do this under terrible conditions. They had signed a contract. So they had no recourse. You can't say, well, I think I want to go home. No, there's no going home. You are here. And there's a military presence to enforce the passbook and the laws that are there. Also, Islamophobia existed in the colonies. The Muslims, remember, 1 in 6 of the Indian immigrants or indentured laborers was Muslim. The other 5, Hindu. Now, previously, as we just studied, Muslims had been, along with other African nations, during the slavery period, and in many cases it was the Muslims who were leading the slave revolts. And as I told you, 2 powerful nations amongst the Muslims were the Fulani or the Fula nation of the Fouta Djallon region, which is now Guinea, Sierra Leone, all those areas, which is struck with Ebola too. It's a majority Muslim area. The Mandingo people were actually very powerful. And so in Trinidad, if you, if they want to call you a name, if a Muslim was acting up or too, tough, they say you a Mandingo. So they throw this name. And in Guyana, they call you a Fula man. Now, it's surprising for many of our Guyanese brothers and sisters who are here in all of our masajid, right? It's a shock to them, because when they were young, they would call you Fula man. Okay? They were actually calling them a Muslim, because you're Indian Muslim, and they're calling you a Fula man because it was the Fulanis and the Mandingos were the troublemakers during the slavery period, with the African slavery period. So they're using the same terminologies on the Indian Muslim as well, calling them Fula and calling them Mandingo. But what they were actually doing was recognizing the unit, the connection between the 2 groups. 5 years is the contract. In 1851, the British said, okay, we're going to make a deal with you. If you've stayed 10 years, 5 years, if you really want to, get a deal, stay another 5. So they keep you another 5. After 10 years, according to the contract, you have a free ticket home. You have a free ticket. Of course, this is a difficult journey again, 10 to 18 weeks on the ocean to get back to your home. What are the conditions in Calcutta at that time, in Madras? Not easy situation. They wanted to get away from that. They thought they were going to the New World. And so the British, very cunning again, figured out a way to keep them there. They said, we will pay you 5 acres of land, and we'll give you 5 British pounds to start your crops. And 5 pounds in those days was a lot of money, actually. And 5 acres of fertile land in Guyana or Trinidad or Jamaica, that's a nice piece of land. So what they were offering them is a type of independence. But they wanted them to stay because they wanted the labor, right? So they would let you have your land, but you still labor for them. So they used this, and because the conditions at home were not that easy, and after 10 years, maybe children are born, life has changed. Many of the Indian immigrants decided, we're going to make this home. And so they stayed, for the most part, in the Americas, finding the largest populations of these immigrants were in British Guyana, in Trinidad, also in Dutch Guyana called Suriname. In Jamaica, there was also a large population, but not nearly as large as Trinidad and Guyana. In other islands, you find the population as well. But the Muslims had difficulties. They had difficulty maintaining their faith because they did not carry scholars with them. So there were not many scholars, just a rudimentary, basic form, of Islam. But still they resisted. They resisted. Their resistance was not like the African slaves. The Africans who were in slavery and also coming from nations, especially the Muslims, were coming from powerful nations. They may have been captured in a battle and then brought there. Some of them were generals. Some of them were like scholars who were captured. So it's a different situation than somebody who's fleeing, poverty and just trying to get out of the country. So the Africans had the abilities and the organization to make revolt. So they made revolutions, armed revolts, where they literally conquered territories. In Jamaica, the Maroons conquered the central part of Jamaica, and nobody could conquer the Maroons. As I said, in Suriname, they took the interior, nobody could conquer them. It was different amongst the Indian immigrants, but their resistance was still strong. It was a kind of a silent resistance. So what they did was they resisted by establishing their religion. Because one of the parts of the colonization process was to get the slaves to become Christians. Now in the case of the slaves, and the indentured laborers, there's a difference. With the slaves, they take away your name, take away your language, you can't pray, you can't read the Quran, you cannot practice any form of Islam, and then they say to you, Jesus loves you, so come to church. So the only way that you could practice your faith was to go to the church. So Muslims would go to the church. Inside they're saying the Fatiha, like we saw Abdurrahman ibn Saudi when the missionary said, can you write the Lord's Prayer in Arabic? And he said yes, and he wrote the Fatiha. Because the man couldn't read Arabic, right? That was a resistance. And but still, because they lost their names, lost their culture, lost their attachment, they were forced to accept Christianity, and they made their own version of Christianity based on their original religion. But with the Indian immigrants, it was different because it was against the law, according to the contract, for the colonial people to change people's names or force them, literally force them. What they did was they used upward mobility. If you want an education, if you want some money, sometimes you want to get married, just become a Christian. Jesus loves you. So some people, in order to make that change, accepted Christianity on the outside and stayed Muslim on the inside. So names started to get mixed up, and the missionaries were very active amongst the Hindus and the Muslims. But because Hinduism is such a broad-based religion, Hindus have all types. Some worship one God, some worship many gods, So they say, okay, Christian, whatever, Jesus, he's a guru. So we can do it. It was easier for them to become Christian and then maintain their faith inside. Muslim, no. So the Muslims resisted. They resisted the missionaries. What was their resistance? It was to establish masjids. So they established the masjid, And along with the masjid, what they call maktab, they would establish a madrasa along with the masjid to teach the Quran and whatever they knew. And that's a form of resistance, because the goal of the colonial master was to Christianize the indentured laborers so they would be a permanent workforce. They would permanently be part of their society. So this was a form of resistance, and this is one of the original masjids there in the Caribbean region. This on the left is a monument on the site of the first masjid in Guyana. This is in the East Bank, Philadelphia, Essequibo River. And so it's in the Essequibo region. This is considered to be like the mother mosque, there. And then you'll see other masjids starting to come up. Now, what is interesting is because the people generally who went in the indentured labor system had come from the Calcutta area or Madras, and then underneath the Mughal Empire. So you see the masjids in different parts of the world where the indentured laborers went look very similar. On the left here, you have a masjid in Mauritius. That's Mauritius there. On the right, Fiji Islands. So you see the green dome. It's like a Mughal style mosque that was being built. So you see the transferal of culture. And this is an interesting thing that you find all over the areas where indentured laborers found themselves. What is interesting about South America, the country of Suriname, is that the Dutch, because the Dutch had colonized Southeast Asia. Remember now, it was the British, the tea company that set up in India. India was the jewel of the British Empire, but the Dutch were in Southeast Asia. So the Dutch brought to Suriname a large amount of indentured laborers from Java, from Indonesia. So there was large population of Indonesian Muslims as well who came as laborers. And this picture here, if you look at it closely, this is in Suriname. So these are actually Suriname Muslims. Look at the sisters on the left. You think you're looking at Istiqlal Mosque in Jakarta. You think you're in Malaysia or no, that's Suriname. It's a huge number. It is actually the most populated area in the whole of the Americas, is Suriname, proportionately, because there were Indian laborers. There were also Malaysian or Javanese Indonesians. And some interesting things went on. They had a struggle. This is, of course, our Muslims. We always find some way to divide ourselves up. When they were eventually making their masjids, the Java Muslims, because when they made their masjids in some areas, they were actually facing a different direction. Okay, the Indian Muslims were facing west, the Javas were facing east. They were facing different directions, and so they made their masjids in different directions, because like they carried their brain right from their country and landed in South America. What they should have done is taken the directions from South America, right? But we stick in our cultures. So they had a direction as though they're still in Jakarta, and the Indians were still in Calcutta. So they did their directions based upon that. And so you find different directions. Now, of course, with technology and time, things are starting to change. But this is a very interesting situation that happened, where the indentured laborers found themselves in large numbers in the Americas. And their resistance, that's a masjid there on the right. So you see the size of their masjids. So they maintained themselves through a lot of problems. The Muslims from Indonesia were more likely to return home. After the 10 years, they said, I'm going home. So they went home. There's still a large number there, but there was a larger proportion that would return home to Indonesia, as opposed to the Indian immigrants returning back, to India itself. And so there in Dutch Guyana is a large thriving community. In British Guyana is a large community. In Trinidad, in Jamaica, in St. Kitts, in many of the islands there. You go to the Fiji Islands, you also see Muslims there. Strong. Mauritius, it's one of our big communities. And we have people in our Jamaats who have come from all of these areas to Canada. And this is part of the story, and that's very important that we understand this, because our people were in the Americas now. This is South America. This is part of the Americas. And they were contributing to the society. But it was very difficult. And so they started to lose a lot of their faith, especially in the areas where their numbers were not very large. I remember being in Jamaica and doing dawah in Jamaica, and we went to a place called Spanish Town. And in Spanish Town, this is where the Indian immigrants put up a masjid in that, Mughal style, in a sugarcane, area. And we decided we wanted to do dawah. So we cooked some food in a big pot, and we went around to the people in the area who were predominantly Africans. Because in Jamaica, Africans make up about 90% of the population, not like Trinidad and Guyana. So we went around to the African people, and we knocked on the door, and we said, that building there, do you know those people? And they said, yes. We said, what do you think about these people? Who are these people? They said, we don't know. We say, okay, there's Hindus over the other side. Do you know a difference between the two? And they said, we don't know what they believe, but this Muslim guy, he's always carrying a can of water into the toilet. I don't know why he's carrying this water. So whenever you see him carrying the water, that's tahara again, right? They say that's the Muslim, right? Because he has tahara. But other than that, they did not know the difference. These are the African Christians. Okay? So, and in one case, they had this event that they call Hosei. And this is probably, some of them were Shia. And, the 10th of Muharram, Ashura. So then Hosei is Hussein, right? So the only thing that was left for Hosei was to build a float, and they march it through the streets, and they dance like carnival type of thing. March it through the streets, take it to the water, and then they burn it and make some prayers on the 10th of Muharram. So that was the only thing left of their Shiaism. So this is how time will just wear things away. It wears it away. But still, a presence was there. And it was through that presence that Islam eventually started to rise. And inshallah, in our last period, we want to see the rise of Islam again, how they actually came back to the surface. And you'll see many of our masjids here now, our brothers especially from Guyana. The masjid Tariq, right? These Trinidad, that's Trinidadians. Right, and you'll see many masjids now where they're Guyanese. IMO, right? Many masjids, Guyanese. Where did they come from? This is where they came from. This is how they were part of the Americas. And inshallah, in the last class, we want to study the rise of Islam, the revival. How did they revive themselves in these areas to become, probably the most dominant force in the revival? The Indian Muslims were actually the first to revive themselves in the 20th century, and to really, start to lead the revival that was going on in these territories. So I want to open the floor for any questions or comments that anybody may have. This is the indentured labor period, and it brought many Muslims into the Americas, into these. No.
Islam is seeing the revival now, right? What can we do not to sit on the sidelines and just to be part of that revival?
Okay, the question is, what can we do to be part of the revival? Part of it is that we need to understand our own history. We need to understand ourselves. We need to understand our faith, right? What really is Islam? Understand our history. Understand, what Islamic lifestyle is, and to be involved in, the spread of Islam. Inshallah, in the last period, this will be the awakening. And this is where we will talk some practical points about this awakening and how we can be involved in the awakening. But basically speaking, the key thing to remember is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُغَيِّرُ مَا بِقَوْمٍ حَتَّى يُغَيِّرُوا مَا بِأَنفُسِهِمْ. Allah will not change the condition of a people until they change what's in themselves. So the first change we have to make is right within ourselves, right, in our hearts, in our concept of Islam, our relationship with each other, right? That's the first great change, right? And then it starts to spread out. So we will be looking in the last period at the awakening in more details. Any questions anybody has about the indentured period? Floor is open for any general questions.
What does this name, Japanese, where did it originate?
This comes from Java, from Java.
The island.
Yeah, so there's an island, Java, where it actually comes, I don't know the origin of the word, but that's the big island there, it's Java, right? So they say like Javanese. So they took a lot of their slaves from that big island in Indonesia. Yeah, so that was like their ports. So they're mainly coming from there. It's interesting to trace your roots. Again, those people who came either from Java or India, they could trace their roots back, into the ports of call, and some of their families are still there. And the people who have enough wealth are able to return back maybe to their village or their people to let them know that we were the ones that left, 150 years ago. We left you, now we're back. So that's a kind of a roots type of thing, and finding out your lineage and going back. Now, any other general questions anybody has?
Yeah, the Surinamese, although they were divided into three different colonial systems, in appearance, they look different than Africans. They are closer to East Africans, because I have seen them in Holland.
In Holland.
Yeah.
Mm.
And I actually get
Yeah.
confusion. I thought they were Somali,
Okay.
and I greeted them in Somali. So how would they be that different?
Okay, you're talking about the Surinamese who came from Suriname and went there. Okay, within our systems, the people who travel abroad are usually the more educated, wealthy people. And in the colonial systems, that would be what we call mulatto, the mulatto. The mulatto are mixed race. So they are not the pure African blood that came from West Africa. If you go to Suriname, to the pure African blood, who are still down, the poorer people, then you will see people who look exactly like West Africans. Yeah, but the ones who mixed with European blood or Indian blood or Arab blood, they mixed, and then they come out, and they will come out looking like a Ethiopian or a Somali, or, if they're very light-skinned, they might look like an Egyptian or a Moroccan. But these are the mixed people who usually get the chance to travel. But if you go to, I've met Surinamese from down there in their countries, and they are very dark-skinned. They're not, they are clearly West Africans.
Yeah, I just want to give a little comment that the colonial system always was trying to put one group of people over another group of people. So even when you bring the indentured servants, as you would call them, or indentured people, part of what they were able to do in the Caribbean was to give the people who came from India and other places a little bit more power over the Africans. And so what played out maybe in the 20th century and the 19th century was a lot of rivalry and a lot of ethnic clashing. Because what they did is that the British were very clever of using the different colors of people to make a sort of a racial hierarchy. So the closer you were to the European or the white.
Do we have that mic, brother? Does anybody know? We don't have the mic. Okay, go ahead.
The more educated or the more opportunities you would get. And that's the same kind of system that they did in South Africa.
Right.
And so it was just something interesting to know, because you would understand why Islam didn't come down into the African groups of people, because of that close proximity.
Right. Well, there's a lot of similarity in the apartheid system where they divide people up. You'll see it even in the United States, where they had mulatto societies, and then, of course, especially in the colonies there, you'll see a lot of similarity in how they divide people up and make zones where they live, and even make one against another. This is all part of the colonial system of keeping people down. So alhamdulillah, that takes us through this period. And next week, inshallah, we're going to go on to the economic migration period. And we're going to look at immigrants coming from the Ottoman Empire, Arabic-speaking people, Turks, Albanians, coming not only into America, but in Canada. So we'll be looking at Islam in Canada as well next week, inshallah. Have a safe journey home. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.